All right, let's talk about something that's hiding inside pretty much every piece of tech you own, memory. And it turns out there's a surprisingly old school, almost agricultural secret that explains why its price goes on such a wild roller coaster. I mean, seriously, have you ever noticed that? One year, a new phone comes out, and the next year's model, with maybe a bit more memory, costs a whole lot more, or sometimes a lot less. It feels completely random, right? Well, it's not.
So here's the central idea for this whole explainer, and it's a bit of a mind bender. The super high-tech DRAM chips in our gadgets behave almost exactly like basic old-school commodities. Yeah, I'm talking about things like oil, metals, even grain. It sounds crazy, but the market forces are just startlingly similar. So let's dive into our first section. How on earth did this incredibly advanced piece of technology get stuck playing by the same rules as a barrel of crude oil? And look, this isn't just some quirky theory. It's a really well-documented pattern. The source material for this explainer puts it perfectly, saying the memory market sees, quote, periodic price spikes driven by tight supply, investment cycles, and demand shocks, which echo classic resource booms. It's the same story, just with silicone instead of soil. All right, so to really get this, we need to see it in action, because this isn't a new thing. This pattern has been repeating itself for decades. This timeline is basically our roadmap. We're going to just quickly walk through these key moments in tech history and see how the DRAM market kept acting just like a traditional commodity, time and time again. So let's jump back to the 80s. DRAM is becoming essential, right? And there's this fierce competition, which leads to these brutal price wars. Some companies just couldn't hang, and they had to get out of the market. But the moment they left, poof, suddenly there was a shortage and prices shoot right back up. And if that sounds familiar, it should. It is a direct parallel to the oil shocks back in the 1970s. You had a handful of producers who made decisions that dramatically cut supply. And what happened? Massive price spikes all over the world. It's the same pattern, just a different product. Okay, now let's go to the 90s. The PC boom. Everyone, and I mean everyone, wanted a personal computer, and demand for memory just exploded. The problem is, you can't just build a multi-billion-dollar chip factory, a fab, overnight. So demand completely outran supply. Prices jumped, and then, when all those new factories finally came online, the market was flooded and prices crashed. Boom, and then bust. You see this exact same dynamic in mining. It takes years and a huge investment to open a new zinc mine. By the time that new supply is finally ready, the market demand might have totally changed, and that's what triggers that same exact boom-bust cycle. All right, let's fast forward to something a little more recent. Between 2017 and 2018, you had this explosion of smartphones and these massive cloud data centers, creating another huge surge in demand for memory. And you guessed it, supply couldn't keep up. That led to a major supply crunch and, yeah, higher prices for all of us. This is a perfect mirror of the energy shocks in the mid-2000s. Global economies were booming, creating this huge demand for energy, but the supply was inelastic. It couldn't just stretch to meet that new demand quickly. The result? A massive price spike. See? The pattern just keeps holding up. So we've seen that this cycle happens over and over again. Now let's unpack the why. What are the actual mechanics that force DRAM to behave this way? What's the playbook? It really just boils down to this simple three-step recipe for a boom and bust cycle. These aren't accidents, they are structural reasons that are baked right into the DRAM industry itself. Okay, reason number one, and we've kind of hit on this already, is the incredibly long investment cycles. Building a new state-of-the-art semiconductor fab costs billions, with a B, of dollars, and it takes years to complete. That means supply is just incredibly slow to react. If demand suddenly surges, you can't just flip a switch and make more memory. Number two is this idea of technology substitution. In the DRAM world, there is always a newer, faster, more efficient generation coming right over the horizon. Think about DDR4 getting replaced by DDR5. These new generations are always competing with and eventually just replacing the old ones. It's actually a lot like agriculture, where new, more resilient types of crops are developed and they gradually take over the fields from the older varieties. And reason number three, sky-high fixed costs. It is incredibly expensive just to keep the lights on in a chip fab. So when prices crash, the weaker producers, well, they just can't afford to stay in the game, and they exit the market. This consolidates the industry, reduces the overall supply, and perfectly sets the stage for the next shortage when demand inevitably picks back up. Now, as good as this analogy is, and it's a pretty powerful one, it's not perfect. So let's take a quick look at a few key differences that make DRAM really unique.
See, with classic commodities like oil, the supply is ultimately limited by what's physically in the ground. But the supply of DRAM, that's limited by the laws of physics. And while substituting oil with something totally different is a really slow, hard process, in the world of computing, brand new types of memory can pop up and completely change the game. And this brings us to a really key concept: scaling limits. For decades, the way we made memory cheaper was just by shrinking the tiny little cells that store data. But we're now hitting a physical wall. As these cells get smaller and smaller, it gets a lot harder for them to reliably hold a charge. This physical barrier is the main roadblock to making things cheaper and better, and that's something you just don't see in the oil or grain markets.
So, after all of this, what's the big takeaway? Why does understanding this whole DRAM as a commodity thing actually matter to you?
Well, the biggest takeaway is this. Those wild price swings for your gadgets, they're not random. They are part of a predictable boom and bust pattern. And once you have this mental model, you can understand the news differently. When you hear about governments pouring billions into new chip fabs, you'll see it for what it is: a strategic move in a global commodity market. It also gives you a lens to see how the next huge thing, like the insane memory demand from AI, is already setting the stage for the next big cycle.
And that leaves us with a final, pretty fascinating question. The demands that AI is putting on memory are just staggering. It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. So, given the playbook we've just gone through, are we standing on the edge of the biggest boom and bust DRAM cycle in history? That right there is the billion-dollar question. Thanks for joining this explainer.